Hello and welcome to another Office Hours. Today we have Dr. Pamela Wilfang with us. And so we're just going to dive right in. A little bit of housekeeping, actually, before we dive in immediately, is if you have any questions as we're talking, if anything comes up that you're like, oh my gosh, I would love to ask this, do not hesitate to put it in the chat. We have a few questions kind of primed and ready to go on our side. So we're going to go through a few of those, but we'll be looking for questions in the chat for the Q&A portion. So yeah, thank you so much to everyone. I see everyone trickling in already. Thank you to everyone who's on time and excited, or as excited as we are. So we are actually going to be, focusing a lot of our questions today on how, we have transitioned from our roles as conventional pharmacists into being MSLs. And so primarily we'll be highlighting a lot of Pamela's journey on, how she learned about the role to, now being in the role full time. So any questions you have for either of us, please do not hesitate to put them in the chat, and we will hop in right now. Okay, amazing. So thank you again for joining us today. Can you share a little bit about how you first learned about the MSL role, and ultimately what inspired you to go down this path to attain the role?
Yeah, and first, thank you everybody for joining, and thank you to the MSL Academy for having me, and Swathi, appreciate this and appreciate the invite. But so my story, I would say, I think when I was going through pharmacy school, I didn't even know what an MSL was. They didn't really talk about it, right? And then one of my mentors became an MSL. She was an MSL for over a decade, and I don't think I really even knew for sure what she did as an MSL, because again, it wasn't really a thing, and I didn't really have a lot of interaction with MSLs at the time. But then, I was starting to write a few fellowship letters. A few of my students did fellowships. We kept in touch, and they all kept mentioning, hey, like, you would really thrive in this industry world, and you would be perfect for an MSL role. And at the time, I'm like, okay, interesting. I was really happy as director of clinical services and innovative practice at Nucara. And, I really felt like I was making a difference for patients, and I wasn't looking to change anything. I thought I was going to be that 50-year pharmacist at Nucara. I was going on a smooth, ride, but then, COVID happened. We went through the whole, crazy vaccine times. But then, the business priorities kind of changed after that. My role changed a little bit as well with the business priorities. I didn't feel like I was making an impact like I was previously. So I guess I kind of felt like I was at a plateau. And, I'm the type of person that really needs to feel like I'm making a difference. I'm pushing projects forward, making an impact. And, that's kind of when I started to really think about, what my students had said, like, about industry. So I really just kind of went all in. I felt like it was the right time to make a change in my career and take on a new challenge. So here we are.
Amazing. And so you mentioned a little bit about your professional background before becoming an MSL, so serving as, director of clinical services and innovative practice. So could you talk a little bit more about that? And in particular, can you highlight some of the aspects of that role that you think you were able to translate into an MSL role?
Yes, definitely. And I think I'm very grateful for my past, experience at Nucara as clinical director, just because it allowed me to have a variety of experiences. So I think, there are three things that I kind of thought were important to the MSL role that I thought I had a good grasp on after, my 12 years of clinical practice. One of them was my extensive network. Second one is, already having managed a territory of 5 states. And then the third one is, that relationship building and communication skills that I developed over those years. So really kind of going through these individually, having that extensive network of pharmacists, in my territory already, having 5 states, in my role as clinical director, and then having that opportunity to still teach and mentor pharmacy students in that 12 years, being part of the local, regional, national pharmacy associations, and then even adding later on, being part of the board of physician assistants, like all those kind of helped increase that network for me. So just randomly being part of a lot of different things, a lot of different projects, and managing that territory helped me have that network to kind of build on, as I became an MSL. And then, since I was managing that territory of 5 states, going to multiple conferences, this is where the territory comes in, territory management. That second point that I made. So really just kind of gathering insights from, local providers, finding ways to collaborate with local institutions or payers, those value-based programs as clinical director that help with territory management. And then the last one with relationship building and communication skills. They're all kind of tied together, but really already having to make these cold calls to providers, to payers, to patients. I developed a pretty tough skin because sometimes that's tough as an MSL to start. Like, you're going to get ignored a lot. And really that helped me gain that experience to access those, difficult to reach medical practices and institutions. So just having those years of experience was helpful to me, I think. And I'm really thankful to Nukera to giving me all those different experiences and fresh projects so that I had a different experience to talk about based on the interview questions that I got.
Amazing. And so as you started down this path, you're, compiling your resume, you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to start applying to jobs. So what strategies or resources helped you most, would you say, during your job search?
I would say during my job search, probably, LinkedIn obviously was helpful because I could find the positions there pretty easily, filtering all that. I think, doing the informational interviews with people on LinkedIn was helpful, but sometimes, like timing didn't work out with already having another job, right? So, if I didn't have the time to do that, I would try to also make sure, I listened to MSL Talk Podcast at the time. They had a lot of resources. So I tried to listen to at least one on the way to work and one on the way back to work, because it was about like a 20-minute drive to work. So some of those typically worked out. But yeah, I think just kind of hearing everyone else's experiences, whether on a recorded podcast or live, I thought that was really helpful for me, for resources. I never did any mock interviews or anything with anybody, which I thought I probably needed because, I'd always been on the other side of the interview, the person that's hiring someone. But when it came to interviewing, I definitely feel like I hadn't interviewed for 12 years. So just took time to practice, write it all out, do it out loud, figure out what kind of questions are they going to ask me in these questions. So I hear like background feedback. Does this sound okay for you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it sounds good. And I love that you brought up the informational interviews, because that's something that I talk about with, students or, current professionals who are interested in learning more about the MSL role, and honestly just understanding a little bit more of like the industry lingo and just understanding what the role entails, because that'll be always one of the questions that you'll be asked in the interview process is, what do you know about the role, or something like that, or even like, what's your understanding of the role's, influence in medical affairs, or the role's impact in industry, like those sorts of things. So to be able to actually hear that straight from the MSLs that are currently in the field is great. And one thing that I found as I was doing informational interviews as well is, because this is still considered kind of an unconventional role for a healthcare professional, or, someone who's in academia, there are so many people who are willing to give you, 15, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes to just, help you understand the role, because they understand that likely they didn't have that experience. A lot of people don't have, the fellowship experience. Instead, they have years of clinical practice or years in academia, and they're just trying to understand, how can I reframe my experience to be a great, fit for the MSL role. So to be able to have those informational interviews are just so key and important. And I hear people talk about it, but I always urge people that you're not encroaching on anyone's space. You're not, you're not like annoying anyone, because I hear that often. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't want to like, reach out to someone who I have no mutual connections with. That's like, I do that all the time. And I feel like a lot of the reasons that, I am where I am now, and it sounds like the same with you too, Pamela, is like you just had the willingness to like reach out and learn from other people who are in the position that you want to be in.
Yep, exactly. I think if they don't want to, they won't respond if they don't want to talk to you. So it's okay. And
Oh my
again,
God.
that's going to help you build your tough skin
Yeah.
for when you're actually an MSL. So,
Well, and that's the thing is like, if people don't respond, I never take that personally, because likely it's just because they're very busy. I mean, they're an MSL, so they're balancing all these different responsibilities and initiatives and everything and working cross-functionally. And so they might not have time. So just because they're not responding doesn't mean they, are offended or they don't want to respond to you. They honestly might have seen it and missed it, or maybe they don't check LinkedIn that often. So yeah, I always advise not to take it personally, because like 99 times out of 100, or 198 or 199 times out of 200, it's not personal. Okay, great. So we started talking a little bit about, as you were preparing for the interview process and for the application, entire process. So could you talk a little bit about the interview process itself? Like, okay, so you get the hiring manager interview. What happens after that? And I think it's important to highlight, because, these interviews and this process is a little bit different from perhaps some other roles that people who are listening in may have taken a part of.
yeah. So, I think it's fairly similar. I had a lot of interviews with different companies, but typically, you get that screening interview. They're really just trying to see, how do you answer the phone? How do you sound? Do you sound excited? Can you repeat what your job history is and be confident in that? And then really they're like, okay, this person's background looks like it checks out. They're a great communicator. Then typically it would go to the hiring manager. So it would be who your boss is. Typically, and they just want to see, they say it's all about fit, but it truly is. They just want to see if you're going to fit in with the team, fit in with them, if it's the right leadership style for you. So it's not just an interview for you, or like they're not just interviewing you, but you're interviewing them as well. So you can always ask your questions about culture during, that process. And typically if they find that, okay, I think this person would fit well with our team, then they would connect you with, 1 to 2 to 3 MSLs on the team to make sure it really is a good fit, or maybe to give you an opportunity to ask the MSLs about, that the hiring manager, to make sure again that it's a good fit for everybody, right? And then moving forward, the next step is typically a panel presentation. So presenting on something that, a topic that they pick or a topic that you pick. And I think sometimes this is, some like I get good questions on this where, do I pick the actual drug? And like, if you do pick the actual drug that you're going to cover, make sure you know it in and out. Obviously you want to be confident, because they're going to be the experts on that. So they're going to ask you the hardest questions. Other thing, if I'd say like sometimes I typically picked a presentation that was like adjacent, to the topic. Because again, this whole, the whole industry was very different than what I was used to in clinical practice. So, even though I went through a lot of interviews, interviewing people, this was completely different. And you have to handle the interviews a little bit different as well. But then the panel presentation, I think, where most people, where we see most people, I guess, not really make a mistake, but again, you kind of have to be balanced. Like if you're a pharmacist, right, you're used to giving clinical recommendations. So they might trick you into seeing if you would give a recommendation, but really what you have to say is, here's the data that might support clinical decisions that you might make. What do you think? Do you think this is enough data to help you make that decision? What additional data would you need to make that decision? But you're no longer that you're not making clinical decisions anymore. You just have to be scientific, data-based, and really just, not giving your own opinion on anything. So I think that was the most difficult part for me. And then that's where we see some of the pharmacists sometimes struggle during the panel interview process.
I would also add, knowing your audience is so important for the scientific presentation. I have listened to quite a few scientific presentations where you can tell the healthcare provider. So oftentimes, the pharmacist who's interviewing, they're going through the scientific presentation, but they're so used to speaking to patients that the conversation or the way that the information is conveyed actually doesn't quite fit the way that an MSL presentation should sound, given that, those are oftentimes given to healthcare providers rather than patients. So that's also something to keep in mind. Another tip with scientific presentations is, one of the things I always advise on is think of the top 10 questions that you think that they'll ask you. One way you can do that is, you can practice your scientific presentation with someone who may also be a pharmacist or may be another healthcare provider or a PhD, but are maybe not super familiar with that particular therapeutic area or that particular drug or disease state. And then you can actually see, what sorts of questions they might have. And then the super tip is not only to prep for those 10 questions, but also maybe even having a slide or a few slides that pertain to some of the questions that you may not end up presenting, but you just have in your back pocket, because you can always just flip to them if a question is asked. Just to have, and it makes you look really prepared and ready to go. You're already anticipating what sorts of questions or inquiries that people are going to have, so that you already, have them. Not only do you have the answer, but you have the answer in a slide form.
Yep, exactly. Great tip. You can also, if you're not sure what questions they might ask, which I think, it's tough to really, they're going to ask you, why do you want to be an MSL, or what pushback do you think you would get on this topic from providers, and how would you handle that? But I'll just push that AI is your friend. I actually use AI a lot as an MSL. So you can just plug a few prompts, be really specific, practice with AI to see what kind of things it pulls up for you. What kind of questions would I get on this journal article, or what kind of pushback do you think I would get on this article from providers? So others are probably using AI. So if you're not, then you might be at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and I mean, and what are the experts saying is AI is not going to replace you. It's going to be people who are using AI who are going to replace you, right? Okay, amazing. So moving on to the next question. So many aspiring MSL struggle with, feeling like they don't have industry experience, or they don't have MSL experience, and they look at the job postings and they're like, oh my gosh, it says suggested, 1 to 2 or 1 to 5 years or something. So how can they overcome this barrier, and how can candidates position themselves as, being the best fit?
It's all about timing. I would say that's probably the biggest thing, timing, right? So when are you applying? Who are you applying with? Who is on the team already? Who is the manager? What are they looking for? So, going back to my previous industry roles, I did ask my managers, why they selected me. Why was I so special? Not that I was special, but I was just curious, right? Because I made it through, I broke through. So, one of them told me they hired me for, my payer and PBM experience, because there was no one else on the team that had that background. And I wasn't necessarily in managed care, but I was able to really sell that experience that I had with Walmart while I was at Nucera, because I thought that would be a valuable, unique experience to share. And then, another person told me that, their team was focused on hiring a team of strong communicators, strong relationship builders, didn't really care a lot about experience. They wanted some, experienced MSLs. They were willing to take some new MSLs, but really wanted those, strong communicators, since that is a big foundation of a great MSL. But, when I look at myself also, just, if you do get to the interview, you want to think about, okay, what other barriers do I see? Obviously, no experience, but then those transferable skills I talked about, right? My network, the territory management that I had, like I was already used to traveling and knew what that was like with a family, right? And then, my communication, relationship building skills. Those are the three important things that I found that I could sell myself with. In those interviews, and then on top of that, I was again really thankful to have all the different pharmacy experiences in specialty, compounding, long-term care, veterinary. So I had a lot of experiences to pull from based on the specific roles and questions that I had. But again, I think in the interviews, I was a little nervous as soon as I mentioned, you know, I'm a mom of 3 kids under, 8 at the time, really trying to say like, I already have experience traveling. I know I already go to conferences. Already juggle, travel along with workload, along with family, and, stressing that I know how to prioritize the right tasks and, avoiding that burnout too. But again, just like looking at, yeah, it's just the no experience thing. What are some of the other things that they might pull out that they think are negative, and always just having some sort of answer for it. You don't have to bring it out right away, but thinking about some other things, might be helpful as well.
Definitely. And actually, I said we would leave all the questions to the end, but we actually have a great question in the chat that pertains to what we're talking about. So they asked, how do you express your experience beyond what's in your resume before you're given an interview? Sometimes resumes don't show the extent of your experience properly. How would you answer that?
Yeah, for that, I would say, you want to make sure you put that experience in there. So, I mean, again, if you want to reach out individually and let me know what that specific, experience is that you want to portray, we can kind of work on that specifically. But again, like my advice is just making sure like all your like, project management, and then you can list all the projects in there. If you feel like it's important, just make sure it's a concise bullet. You can use multiple bullets if you did multiple things during a specific project. So yeah, I would say make sure it's in there. Like, and I feel like, the length thing people talk about, oh, it has to be 1 or 2 pages, but I do think that a lot of people have debunked that now, where like when I was applying my CV, honestly, okay, this is crazy, but my CV started out at like 19 pages, and then I had to cut it down, right? I could only cut it down to 6 pages because I feel like that was all the experience that was relevant to industry. So just make sure that the information is relevant that's in there. You don't need to include things from like undergrad or anything like that. Even if you're further on into practice, it's probably not important to include anything that's from like college
Mm-hmm.
either, so that kind of saves some space if you're wanting to figure out what to prioritize as well. But I do have a CV like checklist that, I've like created from different recruiters and kind of combine my own. If you want, you can always reach out for that CV checklist to make sure you have the important things in there.
Amazing. Yeah. And the other thing I would add is like for every single bullet, there should be some sort of like action item or some sort of like deliverable or some sort of like outcome associated with it. It shouldn't just be like, oh, I partnered with, or I worked cross-functionally across departments. It's like, that's cool. But like, what was the outcome of that? Like, did you drive engagement? Did you, increase, patient outcomes? Like what sort of thing? And the more you can quantify that outcome, the better. So if you have the numbers to back up, like this was the, improvement in blah, 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 or something. I'm not giving a very concrete example, but I hope I'm like articulating, like what the intention is here. So it's like the more detailed you can, well, rather, maybe not the more detailed, but like the more specific you can be and the more quantitative you can be with the particular outcome, the better. Because, like the real estate of the space on the page is, super important. So every single word, every single thing you're putting on there, as Pamela said, needs to be pertinent to the role. And so if you feel like the resume or CV needs to be longer, that's totally fine. But also understand that the hiring managers or the, HR, they're not going to look at every single word. So there has to be like, if they are going to glance at something, make sure whatever they're glancing at for, like on the first few pages is something that's going to help them get excited to continue to look at the rest of what is there. Yeah. All right, wonderful. So we do have some other questions in the chat that I actually think pertain to what we're talking about. So I'm actually going to dive into the chat again. So we have a few questions here. So the first one is, what are some of the most common mistakes aspiring MSLs make when applying or interviewing? We hit on some tips that kind of, talk about some of the mistakes, but we can be a little more explicit. So Pamela, why don't you start, and then I can hop in if I want to add anything.
Yeah, sure. So most common mistakes. So when applying or interviewing, again, it's hard to know because it's hard to know what you need to do. And I did so much research. I listened to a lot of podcasts, but again, like making sure you have the right information in there, like using the recruiters checklists, right, that they have. Again, willing to send my checklist to make sure you have the right information. I think some people don't do like, making sure your email is like a professional email, right? There's been a recent one that we got where it was like just not professional. I think just like first name, last name at Gmail or something is perfect if it's available, if it's possible. Other things, I think people are way too long-winded. And honestly, I'm really bad at this too. So I'm trying to be very concise in my answers here today, even as well. So just trying to be as concise, clear, specific as possible, right? Outcomes oriented, not what you like. You can list the things that you did, but okay, I worked on this, Walmart value-based program that saved the company, over $2 million, something very big, specific, that is impactful, right? So I think those are a couple of the things. I think there may be wrong answers to why you want to be an MSL. I think it's maybe Swati can kind of go over that too. But I think you want to be honest, but also sometimes people don't bring the outcome back to the patient. So again, we're all healthcare providers. We're all in this for the patient, right? So make sure that your answers always bring that importance back to the patient, or making sure you include some of the mission, vision, values in some of your answers. And that can be pretty impressive as well. So that's all I'll say.
Yeah, because it shows that you actually did the research on the company, and you're actually bringing back your answer to the mission, vision, values of that company. And those are super easily accessible on the website. So you don't need to go like sifting and searching for. You can find that in a very quick email, a very quick landing page, very quick Google search. Okay, so I would definitely echo that. The other thing I would say is about the question about why you want to be an MSL. Please do not say work-life balance, because I feel like that is like everyone and their mother, father, sister, and brother wants work-life balance. So like to say that that's the reason you're going after a specific role is not going to resonate, because it's not anything that we haven't heard before. But at the end of the day, like there's so many other jobs where you can get work-life balance. I mean, you can be an ER doctor and do shift work and be gone for 8 hours and have the other, 16 of the day, and then you get your work-life balance, right? So there's so many different sorts of jobs that can give you work-life balance. So don't say that. And then the other thing is, the one thing that I really love and always stands out, whether I'm recruiting for an internship, for an MSL role, like you name it, man, if you send a follow-up email, I will remember you, because so few people send follow-up emails. They can be as simple as, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for, hopping on a call. And then they insert maybe one sentence about something specific we talked about, or something specific that was brought up on the interview. And then, they look forward to hearing about next steps. Like it could be 3 sentences, but just the fact that someone has taken the time, effort, and energy to write a thank you email. Like I can say like some of the people who have stood out to me and who have ended up landing roles as, when I've been a hiring manager have been those people, because they get that extra, sticker or that extra, one differentiating point when we're deciding between 2 candidates who are both awesome. Sometimes that is one of the tipping factors. So I would consider that, and that's an element of professionalism, because if you think about when you become an MSL, a lot of what you're doing is interacting with people externally and creating relationships. And so you being able to send those follow-ups is really going to demonstrate that not only am I going to be an effective communicator, I'm also going to be great at cultivating these relationships. So that's what I would add.
So there's that question that says, what makes you stand out during APE rotations? I think APPE rotations. So I think, as a preceptor, I was surprised at how little thank yous I got as a preceptor. And just don't forget, right? Same thing for the informational interviews. Like people are using their time to help you at no cost, right? I mean, you have to pay for school, but the preceptors are not getting that. So just make sure you send thank yous to those that, on rotations, and those that are helping with informational interviews as well, because you never know when you're going to run into them again. And even if they're an MSL now, they might be, a field director later. And, I can always go back to my LinkedIn messages and see how that communication looked between that person if you are looking for a job in the future. So again, everybody says it, but it is a small world. So those thank yous do mean a lot.
Definitely. And then I'm going to actually hit on, we're getting some really amazing questions in the chat. So I want to answer a few other ones. So someone was asking, can you share the names of podcasts you were listening to that you mentioned, or any other resources that you can benefit from? So there is MSL Talk. So that's the one that Pamela was referring to. But actually the MSL Academy just launched one as well, because that is, something that we saw as like there's only one podcast out there with people talking about this stuff. So there is so much more opportunity to share other people's stories and other people's journeys and other things that even current MSLs can benefit from, as well as aspiring MSLs. So I would say those. And I mean, those are definitely the main podcasts I would refer to. The MSL Academy is really excited about building out, like our blog. We have tons of really great information that's just free, that you can just go to the MSL Academy and look at the blog, like things from, tips on interview and aspiring MSL stuff, all the way to, how to manage your KOL lists as a current MSL. So those would be some resources I would recommend. Do you have any other additional ones, Pamela?
Yeah, I guess as you're interviewing too, what I did was listen to podcasts on the therapeutic area or the drugs or whatever is related to what you're presenting, because I think that's the way that I learned the best also. And if you hear people talk about it, and if you hear different people talk about it, then you might actually figure out this might be a good way to answer a question if I get it. So I would always listen to podcasts on the topic area as well. So not a specific podcast, but just search for it, right? And you might learn something based on the drug. It'll be like, hey, or there might be a journal club on your journal too that you present. So that could be helpful also.
Oh, I would also add, you actually helped me remember some other resources. So if you're interested, there are things like to keep like up to date on the news and what is going on. So when I was doing interviews, it's been a minute, but when I was doing interviews, more like the most recently, I was looking at like Fierce Pharma, Fierce Biotech, and I was looking at other like news sites like that. I actually did get them the newsletters to my email. So as far as I know, that they're still free. But what I would do, like before interviewing at, insert company here, I would just like search on Fierce Pharma, Fierce Biotech, any of those like newsletters, and just see like, is there any like interesting news? Because then that becomes a really cool question that you can ask at the end of like a hiring manager interview of like, oh, I just saw this news that came out. Like, how is that impacting your medical affairs team? Like something like that. Or like when I was interviewing, there was like an imminent M&A that came out. And so I was like, Celgene, like, how's that going for you? Because they had just gotten acquired. So like sometimes there is like big news that pops up when you're interviewing. And so you're able to have that discussion. It also shows that you're able to stay on top of what's going on in the field, which is, again, another super pertinent skill to being an MSL. Okay, great. Okay, so we have some other great questions in here. So the next one I wanted to ask is, what would you recommend for someone looking for an entry-level MSL role? Actually, maybe I should wind it back and actually read the whole question because I was trying to paraphrase and I got confused. So someone asked, I'm actually looking for an MSL role. So she has a pharmd background. A lot of roles include a requirement of 3 to 5 years as an MSL. Would you recommend looking for an entry-level MSL or try to outweigh the requirement of MSL experience with previous clinical experience? Ooh, this is an awesome question. Do you want to start and then I can?
Yeah, I think it's tough, right? So you have to be realistic about your competition, right? So it doesn't really matter what the role says. So again, it's all about timing, but who are you competing with? Typically, there's hundreds of applications in for each MSL role, right? So even if it says entry-level role, in my opinion, an MSL role is not an entry-level role. You have to have some sort of transferable experience to get that role, to be competitive, because, again, there are likely others with experience, maybe in that therapeutic area, in that territory that you're applying with. So, what experience do you have that makes you stand out? It's definitely hard when like the new grads come too, because, the chances of landing an MSL role right out of school is pretty low. I've never seen it happen. I've seen a lot of my students get some of like commercial roles right out of school. No MSLs yet right out of school. I'm not saying it's impossible, but again, just be realistic about who else is applying, who are you competing with, again, it's going to be narrowed down by AI systems. So again, it's going to match your resume and your CV to the job description. What is that percentage match, right? There's other referrals that come in, right? So referrals of people that know people that want to get into industry. And then you might also be competing with internal candidates as well. So it's tough. I'm not trying to discourage anybody, but it can happen if you have the right timing, the right company, because sometimes, some people can't pay enough to get to get an MSL with experience that they want. So sometimes, those lower paying roles might be a good way to get in too, or if you're not trying to ask for too much money, that might be a little bit more competitive. Because usually, like, as you get through the MSL, people start to get bumps, and then you typically have to match that to be able to move. So those are your opportunities to kind of get in as well, when maybe it's a biotech that might not have, the money to compete. So.
Yeah. So my hot take on this is that, even if you have 3, 5, 10, 20 years of clinical experience, it's just simply not the same as being an MSL in industry. So I would say if it's your first role that you're applying to as an MSL role outside of, anything industry related. So let's say in this context, you have 3 to 5 years of clinical experience, you're going for your first MSL role. I would not suggest going for like a senior MSL role or something like that where they have a requirement of 3 to 5 years, because I just think you're going to be outweighed by your competition who have MSL experience. But that being said, if it says, 1 to 3 years suggested or 1 to 3 years required, I mean, that's when, like, if you're looking at the smaller ranges or like the lower ranges, rather, not smaller, but lower ranges, that's where I see aspiring MSLs who don't have industry experience who are able to break in, because they are looking for, yes, people who might have some experience, but not 3 to 5 years. Maybe the 1 to 3 years is where you can break in and really highlight your transferable skills.
That's a question you could ask in your informational interviews. Like some companies, so you'll learn that some companies don't hire people without experience. Some companies are more willing to hire people without experience. So I'm not going to call anything out on this podcast, but yeah, that's a good question to ask when you have your informational interviews.
Absolutely. Ooh, a question, a follow-up about AI. So someone was asking, what AI tools or LLMs would you recommend getting used to using as an MSL? So they're saying, ChatGPT is there, but there's also ones for clinical studies like Notebook LM, SciSpace. I'm wondering, Pamela, if you use any particular ones.
So ChatGPT honestly is what I use. And there's different versions if you have access to it. I think, like the O1 version is actually a little bit more specific if you can use that version. Because it has so many like versions now. I think it just gives more detailed answers. And, again, with more experience, you'll get used to asking the correct questions. Like the more specific you are, the better answer you're going to get. Someone actually told me, I've never tried it, but my friend uses this one that's called Gemini something. So that's something that you can look into. So try some different ones. I know like some of them cost money, but now, and once you get into industry, they probably will have a platform for you. But, I think you could have a couple, because then you can get like your 3 to 10 free ones from each one if you're asking a lot of questions, right? So
definitely. Yeah. I mean, a lot of pharma companies now are actually trying to like create their own internally and like train their own based off like, medical affairs teams or like MI teams or like medical information teams and stuff. So I would just start with ChatGPT for now. I that's the one I primarily use as well. Okay, so we have some other really great questions coming through. So I'm gonna pause the other ones that Pamela, that you and I were talking about before this, and we're gonna just go straight to these. These are great. So someone is asking, so they're a pharmacist. They have experience in retail, outpatient, long-term care. And, they're finding difficulty getting past, that initial like AI system that just screens the resumes and everything. And they feel like they're being ghosted. So do we have any suggestions about maximizing the chances of passing through? So I can start super briefly and then I can hand it off to you. So the one thing I will say is they're trained on the job description itself. So I would say every time you're sending out your resume and cover letter for a role, ensure that you are actually taking out key phrases or words directly from the job description, because that is what is the algorithm is trained on. And so if you have like your normal resume that you're sending off to every single role, it may or may not actually hit for all the roles, because every single resume and each algorithm is specifically looking at that job description. And so one thing to keep in mind, so like some companies, like if you've heard the acronym KOL, so that's a key opinion leader. Some companies call that a TOL, like a thought leader, or a thought, what is it, like a thought opinion leader or something. Some call them like SMEs or subject matter experts, right? But it's all the same thing. Literally, it's just each company wants to be special and call it something different. So you have to adjust your resume every time to actually fit what that particular job description is looking for. So that would be the first thing. And that could be one of the reasons why, you're not getting past that, the algorithm system or the AI system, is because you're not tailoring your resume to every single job description. Anything else, Pamela?
Yeah, I would say with that too, again, like keep in mind your competition. It may or may not mean that your CV is getting screened, but if they have a really great internal candidate, they might not even review some of the other ones. That's the unfortunate thing with the competition, right? Or if they have people that already have that experience, then that's where that AI system might kick you out. Because if there's 300 applications and like they pick the top 5, like sometimes that's tough and you might not be seen because honestly, I think most people don't want to do that many screening interviews, right? Like what I've seen is probably maybe like sometimes even 2 or 3 screening interviews if they feel like they really like a candidate. So it's just really tough. So again, if you're not getting interviews, you might need to change something, right? Or add an experience or something, or maybe sell it correctly, like what Swathi was saying. Do you have specific outcomes associated with that retail experience? Like, do you pull out the payer experience from retail? Do you pull out like how much money you're saving or how many beersless medications you've DC'd from long-term care patients, right? How many MTMs you've done, or how much money you've brought in for the company with MTMs, like specific outcomes with that CV. So trying something, we can talk specifically about that too. But yeah, maybe trying to add more specifics or adding things from that job description, like Swathi was saying.
Definitely. And another thing with, the tailoring of your resume and adding more specificity is like, if you're applying to different therapeutic areas, like for different resumes, I think you should be highlighting, especially if you're coming from retail or outpatient or long-term care, you see so many therapeutic areas. So there are so many potential opportunities to put specific highlights of like, if you're applying to like a endocrinology diabetes specific position, let's say like type 2 diabetes position, there should be some bullets in there that specifically speak to some sort of experience that you can pull from any of these, retail, outpatient, LTC experiences that specifically speak to what sort of impact you are able to make in diabetes, because you might be competing with someone else or other people who are applying that are literally, they have done a 2-year, residency in diabetes. And they work in, ambulatory care, and they literally see diabetes all day, every day. So how can you frame your experience to be a great fit? Because not only in long-term care do you see diabetes, you can talk about all those other outcomes that Pamela mentioned. So you become super multifaceted, and you're not just the diabetes specific, specialist. You do all these other things, which makes you an even better applicant. So it's thinking about how to be specific with the job description, but also highlighting the other things that you've done that make you a very unique candidate versus other people. Cool. Okay. So I think that's great. The next question that we have here is, could you describe the core competencies and or day-to-day responsibilities expected of an MSL, particularly in, a certain therapeutic area? So Pamela, I'll let you start with that.
Sure. So I think core competencies, you really have to, and I think that this will relate back to the question on how can you stand out during APPEs as well. So like getting really comfortable with doing journal clubs and knowing how to pull out the data, not just reading the abstracts. Like the discussion is probably the most important part of the article, but really not just knowing how to do the journal club, but like, where is this specific article that just came out going to be helpful for me? Like, is there a specific scenario or a specific question that a doctor is going to ask me where I can use this article, right? It's not just retaining information, but applying it. Same thing through pharmacy school, through any school, right? How do you apply the information that you're taking in? And then day-to-day responsibilities, it really is. I think that I saw another question maybe in this could relate to is the territory management is really difficult for new MSLs, because if you haven't managed a territory before, or if you can get some experience doing this, I think this would be my biggest worry as like a field director, right? And I can see why, because if you have 5 states, so I have 5 states, I previously had 8 states, how are you going to manage that territory effectively? Do you know all the institutions in that, all the important, academic institutions in that territory? Do you know all the important community institutions in that territory? Do you know all the specific community practices in that territory where you would be able to, so it would be impressive if you already knew like how you were going to plan that territory, if you knew people in those institutions, even if they're not in the therapeutic area, right? So my network is basically comprised of pharmacists, right? So if I know any pharmacist in Mayo, which is a very difficult system to access, right? Like they can figure out, like, even if it's 8 degrees of connection, I know someone there that can help me to get access. So that's probably one of the hardest things too. Like if you don't already have the connections or if you don't already have access, that's where the other MSLs with experience are going to be like the network is big because like it's hard to get access if you don't have it. It's very difficult. So I think if someone has an extensive network, um I think that was helpful for me to break into industry because I had that network of being part of these pharmacy organizations, um, and teaching the last, like 5 years of students that became pharmacists and stayed in the Midwest, right? And, so yeah, I don't know if I strayed away from the question, but, day-to-day responsibilities, I think the one thing that people hate is documentation, but that's the one thing I love. So I think I'm really good at that piece of it. But documenting who you see is a big part. And I think people would say that's the not so fun part of being an MSL. So using 2 to 3 days to travel and then the other days admin or I use my evenings to document when I'm traveling in the hotel so I can save that time, in case there's other admin things going on. So I can save that time and be present with my family when I'm not traveling.
Absolutely. So we actually have 2 questions that I'm going to fuse into one because they're more or less asking the same thing. And so both of these people are coming from, academia. And so they're both pretty much wondering, like how do they get into, an entry level or, their first MSL role? And are there any other roles that we would suggest that they look at, and then maybe they can transition from that role to an MSL role? I would suggest things like looking into like a medical communication specialist or a medical information specialist, like something else that's still within the realm of medical affairs. But I do see this often of like people who start off in kind of in-house medical affairs, and medical communications is kind of creating some of the materials that the medical field team like the MSLs will go off and use and, present the decks at a conference or at, a hospital system or a private practice sort of a thing. So, to be able to get that in-house experience and create and build your network in medical affairs in general, go to the conferences, all of those great things, that can be an amazing stepping stone. And oftentimes there's a lot less competition for those sort of in-house roles that are considered a bit more entry level versus an MSL role wherein, once you get that experience in-house, to be able to bring that and translate that to an MSL role is an awesome way to get your foot in the door. Anything else you want to add to that, Pamela?
Yeah, I would just say sometimes the roles, like our roles, are called scientific communications. So I think learning the term, like everybody calls things differently. Like Pfizer's, I think MSLs are field directors or something. So just as you do your informational interviews, maybe try to make sure you know what those med info scientific communications roles are called at that company, because then you just have a wider base. Like you might be able to search for something that others might not know, if you're more educated on some of that terminology, and you might be able to, just less competition in some of those that have the different names, right?
Definitely. So the next question we have is about the difference between what's a sales rep versus a medical science liaison. Like, what's the difference? And, could an MSL role, like we were talking about the stepping stone, could medical sales or a pharmaceutical sales rep be another stepping stone opportunity? So I'll let you start with that.
Yeah. So I think when I started, I'm pretty sure I didn't know the difference between a sales rep and an MSL. And whenever I do my pharmacy presentations now, I always ask people if they know what an MSL is or who works with an MSL. Because really, like what I say is the difference is our metrics are not they're not based on the number of prescriptions that are written. So sales reps, they have to sell the product. They should be fair and balanced, right? They should provide efficacy with safety. But their metrics are based on prescriptions and the number of prescriptions that are written. And then the MSL comes in is basically the MSL is a scientific resource for the sales reps. So the sales reps can talk about anything that's in the package insert, it's PI, right? So PI is package insert. It can also be principal investigator. PI stands for a lot of different things in industry. But yeah, so they can talk about things on label, but then the MSL comes in and they can talk about things off label. They can bring in additional data that the provider asks about, but our metrics they're quality based, right? So we're trying to gather insights from these experts to figure out, okay, yeah, like I said earlier, like, what do you think about this data? Does this data help you make, good clinical decisions in this therapeutic area? What additional data do you need? If we did some more, I guess just kind of like just digging deeper is what the MSL is there for. And it's not promotional at all. So sales is promotional. MSL is not promotional. We have to present balanced information. So we're just providing data, not giving recommendations at all either. So I'll stop there. I guess you can continue.
Yeah, definitely. And then in terms of the stepping stone, is like, it's possible people could go from the, like pharmaceutical sales role and transition into an MSL. Like actually one of my colleagues who I, went through the interview process for fellowships with, he, did not get a fellowship. He got a pharmaceutical sales rep, role right out of pharmacy school. So that, as Pamela was talking about before, like people out of school sometimes can land these commercial roles like right out of school. But after doing that for 2 years, he has now transitioned to an MSL role at the same company. And I think in like some of that was in part to, the opportunity that he had to network internally and understand, okay, like, what exactly is medical affairs? How can I play a role? How can I translate my now experience in pharmaceutical sales to becoming an MSL? Because that was his ultimate goal, was to become an MSL. So he actually was able to do that exact thing. And so while I don't think that is, something I hear all the time, I hear more of people starting within in-house medical affairs and then transitioning to field. I do think that it is possible to have that as your stepping stone. Okay, amazing. Let's see, we are literally at time, which was super duper quick. I want to fit in one quick question, just because I see some others in here that we haven't touched on. I tried to clump a few, but someone was asking, could you guide me on like pretty much how I'm going to interpret this question is like, what would be like one key takeaway from today's chat, or like what's the first step you would advise someone to do as they're, embarking on this journey to get their first MSL role?
Yeah, I think, one thing I would say is do your research first, obviously, right? Do some informational interviews, but maybe do your research first. Know the person that you're talking to. Don't just jump into some of those informational interviews and ask what they do and ask where they live, because technically that information is available to you on LinkedIn, right? If you've connected with them on LinkedIn, it's much more impressive if you know a little bit about like where they've worked, where they live, and you can ask AI to give you some insightful questions to ask. But honestly, give it the prompt, like what are 10 insightful questions I can ask a PhD or a pharmd or an MD that's an MSL at Amgen, if I have an aspiring MSL that wants to work in like rare disease or something, right? So then it kind of gives you a base, because sometimes you don't want those meetings to be awkward. So it gives you questions to ask. But again, I think like AI is going to be your friend. So that might be my one thing. Try to practice with AI, do your research before you have conversations with people so you can feel more confident.
Definitely. Amazing. And we have one minute left, so I'm just going to answer this question quickly. So would you recommend starting with a device company versus a drug company than trying to break into the MSL role? So some device companies actually have MSL roles, so you can definitely look into that. There also are some health tech companies and consumer tech companies that are looking to also incorporate MSLs if that's something you're interested in. And I would say, it doesn't, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a detriment if you start with a device company or a tech company and then transition to a drug company. It's just, how do you get that transferable experience? Is the transferable experience an MSL role in a different sector? That's cool. Or is it a clinical role where you're actually interacting with healthcare providers, you're educating, you're thinking about, payers, like all of these other sorts of aspects that can come together and make you a successful MSL. So it's more about that transferable experience and getting your foot in the door with your first MSL role, because once you have that first one, it's so much easier to get your next one and then move up. So I would look at it more in that way. And we're out of time. Oh my gosh, that was so quick. But thank you so much to everyone for these amazing questions. Wow, like this was so great, so interactive. And thank you, Pamela, for your insight. It was awesome. If you want to connect with either of us, please do not hesitate to reach out to either of us via LinkedIn. And if you want to learn more about the MSL Academy and the programs and services that we have for aspiring MSLs, you can reach out to me or check out the mslacademy.com. All righty. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks,
and
everyone.
talk soon. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.